Hi everyone, welcome. I'm down here in my wormery, and the bin that we have in front of us, it's a 38-day-old tub with red wiggler worms in it. It's received a couple of feedings, and it's been 10 days since we last fed it. I don't know if 10 days is too soon to come back into the system to check if it needs any food, but even if it only needs moisture, that's fine. I want to see how it's doing 10 days after it was last fed, so I'm going to get it up on the bench and we're going to take a closer look. So we've already covered the age, 38 days, and the interval that has elapsed since the last feeding, which was feeding number 2. Prior to that, there was one feeding applied after the bin had reached an age of 14 days of age. We waited another 2 weeks for feeding number 2. The reason we're going with a shortened interval now is because we had adopted a switcheroo sort of pattern where we would feed on one side one time and on the other side the next time. And I believe that offers us the flexibility to kind of tighten up the interval between feedings and possibly lay in a little bit more food than if we were always feeding in the same place. So I don't know, we'll see how that goes. The only other gibberish that you see here at the bottom is a little formula that I threw together, and the glare on the screen is obscuring the upside down answer so as not to spoil the fun. But yeah, that's those are all the guesses as to how many worms populate this system. 6 guesses altogether, so the average of those numbers is what we treat as the head count, or the worm count of this system here. Here, let me get a glove on. When I reviewed the video for this, I really just scrubbed through the whole thing very quickly just to see if anything stood out. And as I scrubbed across, I do remember the one thing that stood out as unusual for me for a fairly young bin was that I was feeding on the edge, and that's when I was reminded of what we had decided in terms of alternating the side on which we feed each time. It's not unlike what we're doing in one of my other systems where we're switching the feeding location from corner to corner to corner every time, similar to what we might be able to do here too with the 10-day intervals. Since the 10-day interval between feedings on that pocket feeding or corner feeding has been working pretty good, I thought we might try the 10-day interval here too. Although that's going to force us back into the same feeding location within 20 days versus 40 days. Maybe forcing us to contend with leftovers, or maybe just deciding to skip a feeding to give it more time. But I guess this will help us also judge how 10 days did on the feeding that we applied here. This coffee filter was draped across the feeding area to remind us where we last fed. And I gotta tell you, there's an essence coming out of this system. I could tell when I reached over to pick it up off the ground and carry it over to the bench. I could smell some sort of a cabbagey odor. So I wouldn't be surprised. I've been preparing various cabbage dishes lately, and one of them would have been around the time when we last fed this system, about a week and a half ago. So I may have fed cabbage here. And it's weird, because I'm peeling it all back now. You would think I'd get hit in the face with cabbage odors, but I don't really sense it that much. It's not terribly strong. It is a little bit pungent because cabbage is cabbage after all, right? And worms do seem to like it. Okay, like we do sometimes. We sometimes have a single piece of the material that we sort of like to track individually from the rest. And in a lot of cases with the head of cabbage or broccoli or something like, you got this sort of heavy-duty stem. So seems like after 10 days they've not been able to do too much damage to it. Now we'll think after another 10 days, if we came back in here to feed again, we'd come back into this corner and probably still find that here as a leftover. As for the rest of the stuff that we're bumping into as leftovers down in here, though, I don't think we're going to have to worry too much about this stuff. It's pretty much mush anymore. Oh, actually, this is a kiwi. So here's the outer side of it. And here's the inside of it, little seeds and whatnot, the green fleshy part of the fruit. So we've got some good leftovers in here, but finding leftovers is certainly not going to dissuade us from applying today's feeding into this edge of the bin where it's never yet been fed before. I guess if we really wanted to go back to see what was happening 14 days prior to the feeding that we're inspecting now, we could probably just check the middle of the bin. Because up until last week, when we decided to start into this feeding from side to side, we were just feeding the first couple times right down the middle like we usually do in all my systems. So there's a good number of worms coming over here to hang out in this stuff, this newest feeding, but a lot of times it's the older feedings that attract the greater amount of worm traffic, because that stuff's just, I guess, been sitting around for longer, has a greater amount of chance to decompose to the point where the worms can take advantage of it. So even though we're seeing a good number of worms down in here, perhaps if we take a quick peek down the middle, maybe we'll see a similar little bit of a crowd, although I don't remember what we fed. At this point, it would have been quite a number of weeks ago and might not show many signs of leftovers. But as far as these leftovers go, I don't mind putting them down deep. I'm sure the kiwi's got no odor, but it's this lump of cabbage that I think is the main offender here. And I know that we saw a few other chunks of the stuff here and there, so hopefully we'll get most of it up against the edge of the bin here, back in its proper place. But we'll bring over some material to make sure it's all covered adequately. And you know what, before we open up a hole on this edge to feed, let's take a quick peek to see how the previous feeding looks, if there's any sign of it. I mean, I could see a few worms here and there. There's not a terribly high degree of moisture. I wouldn't say it's dry or dangerous, but you have to go all the way to the bottom, which is what I just did there, scooping out a little bit of material to find stuff that appears to have an adequate degree of moisture. I don't know, do we add moisture, or do we trust that it's coming along okay and that whatever foods we put in there will possibly bring with them enough moisture to supplement this bin to the point where it's able to hum along nicely on its own? I mean, it definitely seems like it's doing quite nicely on its own. And I'm sure that pretty thorough covering of plastic across the top is helping a lot too. There's not a lot of room for any airflow to happen around its edges. And as you saw, that piece of paper bag that covered the top was completely soaked when we got in here. So perhaps from a moisture standpoint, I'm just going to let it ride. And perhaps when I run upstairs to pull out some food for these little guys, I could see if I can find something that might be prone to ejecting a good amount of moisture down into the bin and keeping things nice and damp in here. Alrighty. I guess we could further excavate this hole when I get back. Let me take a quick break now. We'll go find something for them and we'll get this feeding taken care of. What do you think? Are they going to like it? I think they are. They're even going to have a nice little tough object in here to nibble on for a while. But before we put that in, we're going to do what I like to do usually, even though this bin has no need for it. I like to lay down a little bit of bonus bedding to go with the food. We could drop in this nice massive chunk of food for them like this. We'll even put the stem sort of in the way, so if they're coming from the inside of the bin, they've got to dodge around that big piece of wood to get at the food. Let's stick a little piece behind it to keep it propped up. Now I've got some grit we could sprinkle on that, but you know what, before we put in any coffee, since we've got a nice new coffee filter rolling in here with this portion of coffee, let's use this old coffee filter down here as sort of a little dressing for this feeding. This will turn into bedding now. It won't serve as a top covering or as a feeding zone indicator anymore. So let's get a little bit of this coffee sprinkled down into this hole here. It's still warm. I just took this thing out of the machine. And then I think we could just drop in these remaining few chunks. If we combine it with the warm coffee, even though they're frozen, they're going to thaw out pretty quickly. A couple of these are even frozen to one another right now. This is the type of feeding that I bet if we come back in here 10 days from now, Even though this isn't where we would be feeding, we'd be going back to the other side to feed next time we come back in here. I believe this side is going to show little signs of leftovers. Maybe that stem for sure will be in here, but as far as pumpkin, I don't know. 10 days though, it's not that long. It might, it might surprise us a little bit. We might see some leftovers. You know what, before we cover up completely, let me just drop in a little bit more grit too. A nice new bin like this one here, just a little bit over a month old. I got no problem being pretty generous on the grit. Generous on the bedding. This is pumpkin over here. I'd really like to have it covered up better than that, but since we're draping a feeding zone indicator over that feeding zone, and then on top of that we've got that paper bag covering, and then we've also on top of that got the plastic bag, I think we can probably obscure this little piece of food sticking out of the surface for a while, at least until it starts to sink down after the worms start to nibble away at it. So this should be a fun little experiment to see if in 10 days we see any or how many leftovers of the pumpkin. Pumpkin is pretty popular. True that they're still going to be distracted by whatever remains of that cabbage out here, including that big stem, as well as that kiwi. But I can certainly see the new feeding that we just put in here now attracting some attention too. So I think we'll try the 10-day interval, see if it's possible to apply another feeding down onto this side next time we come back. But I put the new coffee filter right on top of where we just fed to show us so we don't get lost. Although it's usually pretty obvious from just the depression that occurs from the consumption of the food. The whole thing seems to drop down. So alright, I got a few things that I need to put away over here and get cleaned up, but I'm not going to waste your time with that because that's boring. Let me just, before I go, really quickly say thank you. Thanks so much for watching. Hopefully you enjoyed the video. If you did, please don't forget to leave me a quick thumbs up before you go, and then also, if you haven't done so, please consider subscribing to the channel too. Alright everyone, have a great day. Thanks for watching. Take care.